After 160 years of use, the tubular feed magazine lever action rifle is still extremely popular, and I think most of us understand why. It has a very slim profile. They're usually pretty lightweight and nicely balanced for easy carry. And with a carbine length barrel, somewhere in that 16.5 to 20-inch length, they're very quick in the woods. And that's where they're prominent, in heavy cover. If you are hunting where your shot is not likely to be more than 150 yards away, and more likely to be 50 yards, one of these tubular feed magazine rifles, even with open sights, might just be perfect for your style of deer hunting. Now, these rifles, of course, are popular because they're so quick you can get on target and shoot and get second shots off if you need to. But they're also really good for running game. Not a lot of us shoot running game anymore, but boy, it used to be a standard. And this is a great rifle in brush country for those close range running shots. But you've got to decide which rifle you're going to want to use and which cartridge it should be chambered for. We've got the Winchester Model 94, which I just held. Then there's the Henry and the Marlin. And they're all remarkably durable and have been proven for years and years. But what are you going to get it chambered in? Obviously, the 30-30 is a top choice, and most of us know that one. But then there's the good old 35 Remington. Not quite as common or popular and not available in all lever actions, but boy, people who love it, love it. Then there's the new kid on the block, the 360 Buckhammer, and that's what this Henry is chambered for. How do you decide which one is better for your style of hunting? Which one has the better ballistic performance? Which one hits harder downrange? And which one is more available? Are you going to be able to find a lot of ammunition from a lot of different manufacturers to find one that's accurate in your rifle if you get, say, a 35 Remington or a 360 Buckhammer? Or are you better off with the 30-30? But isn't the 30-30 a little punier, a little weaker? How are we going to decide? I think what we need to do, in addition to shooting these rifles, if we get the opportunity, is to look hard at the ballistic performance. And we're going to do that now. Covey for the retrieve. Did you get him, Cov? Hey guys, if you're wondering a little bit about the history of these things, the lever action started around 1860, and Henry is the gentleman who first invented one that worked, and a few troops had it during the Civil War. But after that, Oliver Winchester joined. Several people jumped in with Henry and they started working with him to develop that rifle. They came out with what's known as the Yellow Boy, the 1866 model. Winchester, Oliver, bought everybody else out quickly and made it the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. And the Yellow Boy was quite famous, but not all that powerful. So in 1873, Winchester had his engineers upgrade the rifle to what became the 1873 Winchester rifle that won the West in a .44-40, the first center fire cartridge in a repeating rifle. Pretty heady stuff. I don't know exactly when Marlin came along, but boy, by the time they did, they were as popular as the Winchesters, and Annie Oakley was their spokesperson. Talk about influencers. Boy, they had them back in the 1890s, and Annie Oakley was shooting Marlins and shooting them quite well. Henry sort of went away for a while, but they've come back now in the 21st century. The Henry Rifle Company is probably making more lever action rifles and more flavors now than any of the other lever action manufacturers. And of course, you can get lever action copies, shall we call them, from Pedersoli and Rossi and several other companies outside of the United States, because the patents on these actions have worn out, so they can build them the same way. So you've got a lot of options, and we're going to help you figure out which one you might want to pick up. Well, all right, we all know it's fun to be out in the woods, especially eastern woods, with a lever action rifle. The 30-30 lever action among all of them, is probably the most famous and most popular because it's ubiquitous. It's been around since 1894. Actually, 95. The 1894 lever-action Winchester rifle came out in 94, but they weren't quite ready with the ammunition yet. This was the first smokeless round in commercial production for hunters in the U.S., so it was a big deal. And it wasn't until the next year, 95, that it was available. What happened after that, of course, is that the 30-30 sort of just charged through the woodlands of America. And you got to remember, back in those days, whitetail were kind of at a low ebb. We were just beginning with the North American wildlife management process to bring wildlife back. So you had to hunt long and hard and in some pretty heavy cover to get your whitetails. And a lot of this stuff would have been cut over, brushy, really even brushier than it is today in many places. So there were a lot of drives as well as hunting shorelines out of canoes. That was fairly popular. And the 30-30 just worked because it was quick, it was handy. You could just beat it up and it just kept on rolling. And most shots were inside of 150 yards anyway. They weren't not using scopes in those days. Scopes were actually out there. They used some in the Civil War and even before that. But as a practical matter, no. Everyone was shooting open sights. So 100 yards, 50 yards, I would guess the majority of the shots came at those distances. And the cool thing is, even today, in the 21st century, those are typical shooting distances for the eastern woodlands and a lot of the Midwest farm country, too. Once you get out of those big open fields and into the brush lots and wood lots and stuff, you've got some pretty close shots. Plus, so many hunters are limited to small acreage. They might have 40, even 20, sometimes even just 10 acres on which to hunt. So they're going to sit in a stand, not disturb the area, and hope a deer comes by. So close range shots, not a problem. That's probably all you're going to get anyway. So why not the 30-30? So the upshot is that plenty of folks are happy with it, but some, and this goes clear back to 1906, 1908, when the .35 Remington came out, think a bigger bullet's going to kill harder, faster, better, and all the rest of it. We're going to look at those numbers and figure that one out. But what you're going to notice about this .35 Remington compared to the 30-30 Winchester is that it is not rimmed. The rim is what sets the headspace for this one in the chamber. On this, you've got a shoulder. 35 Remington is more of a modern centerfire cartridge with a shoulder to stop it. What it is lacking, though, is chamber pressure. Maximum chamber pressure on that is quite low. What have we got down here? 33,500 PSI. That's 9,000 or a little more than that, less than the 30-30 Winchester. That one is allowed 42,000 PSI of pressure. So you're going to be able to drive the bullet faster. But you've got a bigger bullet in the 35. 180 grain, 200 grain is probably the most common, and that's what I think most deer hunters would use. And when you see a 35 caliber up against a 30, just by looking, you think, well, we're going to get a lot more hammer out of that guy. This is a hammer, this is a sledgehammer. We're going to see if we can prove that with the statistics we're going to run here in a little bit. But that is what made the .35 Remington so popular. Just whether it's true or not, people thought you've got a bigger bullet. You're going to be driving at just about the same velocity as the 30-30, so it has to hit harder. Then the 360 buckhammer comes along just a couple of years ago. This is really modern, but it doesn't look modern. I mean, it's not even bottlenecked. You got a little bottleneck on the 30-30. You've got nothing on this, and that's kind of why it was invented. It's for those straight wall deer hunting states. If you're required to use a straight wall cartridge and it has to be of a certain length, most of the old straight walls were longer and they wouldn't qualify. So what Remington was trying to do here is create a cartridge for a traditional tube-fed magazine rifle, the lever actions, that would qualify for legal deer hunting in those states and still come up to the performance of the 35 Remington and or the 30-30, somewhere in that ballpark. So that one is strangely new, even though it doesn't look it. And it is, of course, also rimmed, which makes it real easy for chambering in lever actions. Now, the odd thing about that 35 Remington is somehow it was chambered quite successfully in the Marlin. Winchester, I don't think ever chambered for it. And that led to people thinking that the Winchester could not be chambered for rimless cartridges, but I think they can. You guys can correct me on this. I do believe that there have been a couple of rounds that were rimless that Winchester chambered, but they never did the 35 Remington. And I would guess that was because they didn't want to be competing against themselves with the competitor's cartridge. They did have a 32 Winchester Special for a while, which was essentially the 30-30 necked up to 32 caliber. That one really doesn't perform any better than the 30-30 does. So the 32 Special, really not on the landscape anymore. So what will the 3060 Buckhammer have for chamber pressures? They're giving that guy some modern chamber pressures of 50,000 psi. Pretty nice. That should give it a little bit extra velocity. So let's just see what these will do. I've got my handy dandy chart here, and you're going to see that the 35 Remington will shoot 180 grain bullet, 2,150 feet per second, more or less. And that's going to give you 1,848 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. That doesn't mean much. Not too many of us are putting the muzzle right up against our deer when we shoot. What's going to happen downrange? That's what counts. At 150 yards, you've still got 981 foot-pounds of energy left in that bullet. More than enough. We pretty regularly use the barometer of 1,000 foot-pounds of energy on target as being adequate for deer. I don't think that's absolute. You could easily get by with 800, even 700, and I've seen plenty of times when 400 or 500 would work. It's just kind of a benchmark to shoot for. So there you are, 981. Now, if you put a 200 grain bullet in there, you're going to drop your velocity to only 2,000 feet per second. Your muzzle energy is going to actually drop to 1777. And then at 150 yards, you're going to retain 962 foot-pounds of energy. So this kind of puts the lie to, I think, what most of us would assume is that 35 with a heavier bullet is going to hit harder. Boy, it sure doesn't look like the numbers are adding up on that one. And I would say that's because you're reaching that point at which the bullet weighs too much for the powder capacity of the case to drive it fast enough to make up for that. That's the reality. Now, the 360 Buckhammer, same deal. It's a 35. Don't worry about that 36 in the name there. It's a 35 caliber, 180 grain bullet, a little bit faster, 2,400 feet per second. That means you're getting 2,302 foot-pounds of energy, and it's going to hang on to 1,254. So yes, you definitely do get more energy downrange at all distances out of that 360 Buckhammer. Put in a 200 grain bullet, you're dropping your velocity to 2,180 feet per second. And at 150 yards, you are still hanging on to 1,159 foot-pounds of energy. Again, probably a little less than we would guess. I think it's just natural for all of us to assume that those heavier bullets are going to hit harder. Boy, the numbers just don't bear that out. So there you go. Now, how does the old puny 30-30 stand up to this competition? Generally, you're shooting 150 to 170 grain. Sometimes you can find a 180 grain load, but I think the 170 is optimum. Some folks like the 160, especially that one with a flex tip from Hornady that allows them to make a little more ballistically efficient bullet at 160 grains, so you're getting a velocity in between the 150 and the 170, but because you have a higher ballistics coefficient in that bullet, you can drive it, shoot it a little flatter further down range, so it gives you a little more distance. But energy-wise, it's not a heck of a lot of difference on any of these. The 170 grain at 2,100 feet per second is going to retain 1,113 foot-pounds of energy at 150 yards. This is going to surprise, I think, the 35 Remington folks, because remember, that one's only 981 or 962. It's well under the energy level of the 30-30, which to me raises a question, why bother with the 35 Remington? I know some guys are going to say, well, it's a wider bullet, so you're going to make a bigger hole. Yeah, I'll give you that. You definitely will. 30 caliber versus 35. I don't know that it's going to make much difference on your deer. Essentially, what these bullets are doing is they're causing tissue damage that creates hemorrhaging, so you bleed your animal out. Same as you would with an arrow. It just rips and tears instead of slices and cuts. Unless you hit major structural bone, you break the animal down. And of course, if you hit the central nervous system, it really doesn't matter how much your bullet weighs. You can drop a deer into its tracks with a 22 long rifle using that parameter. So I think what it says to me is that the 30-30 is hanging right in there with both of these. So unless you really, really believe that that wider bullet's going to have a huge benefit for you in some way or another, I don't know that you need to bother getting a lever action in anything but a 30-30. It has less recoil. You look at the recoil chart here on the table, and it only has 12 foot-pounds of energy in the same weight rifle compared to these others. I don't think the difference between 12 and 14 or 15 is a big deal, but a lot of people might notice the difference between the 200 grain bullet kicking out 16.3 foot-pounds of recoil energy with that 360 buck hammer versus the 12 foot-pounds out of the 30-30, something you might want to consider. Now, the other thing is, of course, ammo availability. Right now, Remington obviously chambers or loads ammunition for that 360 buck hammer. I think they have a couple of different loads. I don't know that it matters all that much. Whether a deer's hit with a 180 or a 200, I don't think he's going to notice the difference. But you might not find that ammo you like. If your particular rifle doesn't like to shoot accurately with the Remington options, where else do you go? Now, I may be wrong. Maybe Hornady or Nosler or someone else is now loading those, but the ones that I've seen thus far are just from Remington. Whereas the 30-30's been around for so long that you're going to find ammo made by everyone, everywhere. The 35 Remington, starting to become obsolete. You can still find some loads, Remington, Winchester, Federal, but you're going to have a lot harder time, I think, finding 35 Remington ammunition. I don't know that anyone chambers for it. I should have looked up Henry before I started this to see if they are offering the 35 Remington in one of their lever action rifles. I'm going to guess they are. You guys might want to look that up. Go to Henry online and see if they are chambering for that 35 Remington. I know they're chambering for the 360 and the 30-30, but those are things you also want to consider. Final analysis, which rifle do you get? Boy, they're pretty much all quite similar now. They've been proven for so long. The Henry action these days is pretty much the same thing as the Marlin 336 action. That's well proven. 30-30 Winchester, of course, that Model 94 has been around forever in 6 days. And then you've got Pedersoli versions, and I think Rossi makes some, maybe a couple of others out there. But gosh, there are absolutely millions of these lever action rifles out there in 30-30. And if you have an old 32, nothing wrong with it. It'll do the same as the rest of these, pretty much all in the ballpark. I think what it comes down to, regardless which one you get, figure that you're good for hunting out to about 150 yards. After that, the energy drops quite a bit, and so does the trajectory. There are some folks who can shoot pretty well if they really work at it, and if you put a scope on, that will help a lot too. But these are short to mid-range cartridges, and they do pretty darn well, and they're fun. I think that's kind of 50% of it for most of us. It's just feels so good to be carrying one of those, and it has a nostalgic flavor to it. It just takes you back to the good old days, shall we say. I don't know if it necessarily makes you feel like a cowboy hero, but you feel like you're in touch with great granddad and grandpa and the old timers who really knew how to hunt using woodsmanship and tracking skills, and they could shoot those lever actions with open sights pretty remarkably well too. So if you want to be an old timer with an old time rifle that still brings home the venison, you might want to try a tubular fed magazine rifle in 30-30, 35 Remington, or 360 buckhammer. I think you'll like it. Hey, until next time, this is Ron Spomer. Hunt honest, shoot a lever action, and shoot it straight.